Amanda Bonaiuto. Such a pleasure to have you here with us for Material Worlds for Evergreen Review. You are an amazing animator, visual artist, filmmaker. Your narrative short films like Hedge have filmed at prestigious festivals like Ottawa and Glass and Annecy. You've worked on a string of gorgeous music videos for primarily indie rock bands, but kind of multi-genre bending bands that have been quite popular and experimental. You've worked with Rubblebucket, King Gizzard, and the Lizard Wizard. You are an educator as well, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks for agreeing to talk with us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. That was such a lovely intro. I'm a little bit like, it's always weird to hear intros, but that was a good one.
Oh, great. I love to hear it. Okay, so you were just talking about some kind of friction or mystery with this Italian side of your family and how that was embodied in some way in Batfish Stew, that's your first film, right?
Yeah. I mean, I consider it my first film, even though I had made animation before Batfish, but I think it was the first film that I made in grad school for sure. And it was also the first piece of animation that I made by drawing. Before that, it's kind of all over the place, which I loved, but I was doing a lot of mixed media, stop motion. I was trying to paint, sort of like make a painting for one frame of animation and move in that way. But there was something about working in so many different processes and also being kind of like not a very settled person. Like I felt like I was kind of moving around a lot, like even just from like apartment to apartment, where like this way of working started to feel like too much stuff. Like I was just like, there's too much stuff going on. And I also found that it was hard to move, like literally hard to animate with objects. So I sort of had this like weirdly limited relationship to stop motion or working more with mixed media. And once I got to grad school and started experimenting with paper, like hand-drawn animation, frame by frame, like traditional, I felt like everything was different. I was like, oh, this is like incredible, even though it's not new. Like has a long lineage, like a long trajectory. Like I felt like I had discovered something, at least like for practice. I was like, okay, this is like actually fluid. I can like think clear in this way, like by just like drawing on paper. And maybe it was like the simplicity of it. It was just pencil and paper, and then you shoot it under the camera and you see how it moves, and then you can kind of return to it over and over again in like a sort of like iterative process. And maybe that's, I don't know, I like haven't gone back since. It's just like been the way that I've worked. And I think it just has something to do with like thinking clearly. I'm like, it works for me.
So paint me a picture. You're a first year student at Cal Arts.
Yeah. First year student at Cal Arts. I had just turned 25. So I was like quite young, and had been living in New York before that, working a whole slew of jobs, just like whatever I could get my hands on, some creative, some much more like practical or service jobs.
The
usual. So I was feeling like extremely motivated to be there. So I felt like
good timing for you.
Yeah, like such a break in that sort of otherwise like, maybe kind of scattered lifestyle. First semester, it was actually required. We had to take this course called Drawn Techniques with Maureen Selwood. And I remember the first day, she was like an hour late, and the teaching assistant, it was the very first day of the semester and the first day of this class. The teaching assistant, Zach Zezima, who was amazing and also like a dear friend of mine now, was just like showing us a bunch of films to like kill the time before Maureen got there. And he showed us a film by Atsushi Wada called In a Pig's Eye, and a film by I probably like Sophie Coco Gate, and also Stammer by Shen Ji, just like these beautiful 2D, like two of them anyway, very like physical films. And I remember like that was, even though it wasn't even the lesson, I was like, it was a lesson for me. Like I really just like internalized something about the way that those films were made. And then Maureen finally got there and she had this stack of paper and she was like in this crazy rush because she had been stuck in traffic. She just like tears the pack of paper open and like tells us all to take a pile and to just like make a cycle of animation and come back next week and just, we're going to put your drawings all over the walls. And I remember going home and I just spent like the entire week working on my cycle. Like, and I was just something really just felt like very freeing about it. And also she had us work from a very specific prompt. Like she had given us all this paper and then had us choose from one of 5 images that were just like random images from the internet to use as a starting point. And I chose this image of a woman who was like smoking. And there was something really beautiful about that limitation because I was just like, okay, it's a cycle. I know exactly what the subject is. I'm just going to kind of go for it. So it was just like, even though it was very CalArts in a way, like professor was super late, like the TA was just kind of winging it. And then the lesson itself was kind of like chaotic. It really it like really put something in motion for me.
What about the context of your classmates and the idea? I only know kind of what I've heard about CalArts, but it looks like the spectrum of the ways that people work there is vast.
Yeah.
And then you're honing back in to the basics, using essentially materials that people have been used to animate for 100 years or whatever. What was the reaction like from your teachers or your peers? Did they try and get you to open back up, or were they like, oh, she knows what she's doing now, she's got her rhythm?
Like the other thing that I'll say is like that semester I also took stop motion. Like I took a whole bunch of elective classes, so I was doing all these things still, but I was really focused on what drawing was allowing me to do. And I think that was the takeaway for my classmates too. I mean, not for them, but I think that's what they were observing. And also in that first year of that program, like you have to make a full film. So there is sort of this, there's of course, like a major emphasis on experimentation and like playing around as much as you can. But there is also an emphasis on like, you need to figure out what you're going to do for this film. There, I guess, like, going into school, I had no idea. I didn't know I was going to be drawing. I didn't know what type of film I was going to make. It was total blank slate for me. So I think there was something kind of great about whatever happened there, where I felt like, I know that I'm going to make a hand-drawn film. Like, that's what I know. And I think, again, like having that somehow, for whatever reason, feeling really clear was helpful in that moment.
I definitely get that.
Yeah.
That's been kind of a theme with everyone I've talked to so far, is about finding certain limitations that feel very comfortable is the wrong word, because there's still a lot of risk happening. But I don't know, connective in a way, connective restrictions that allow for a lot of space to move around, but the solid constrictions that give the work structure, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, they sort of open it up in a way. I mean, I think
they do both at the same time, which feels contradictory, but it works.
I think it's just really true. And having experiences with my students now, this is something that I feel like I witness over and over again. Students getting really overwhelmed with both the idea gets bigger, and then the approach also starts to bloom into something much, much bigger. And there has to be a point where you say, like, this is just one project. Like, what is my limitation going to be so that I actually can do this project?
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you made Batfish Stew your first year. Did you make Hedge your second year?
So the program is 3 years long.
It's 3 years, right?
So the first year I made Batfish, and then the second year was sort of like kind of a bit of a vague year, but it was also meant to be like planning and pre-production for your thesis. So I started Hedge in the second year and I finished it in like the middle of the third year.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, it's kind of open in that way. Like, many of my classmates started making their film in the third year. I was just sort of like feeling a little bit like I wanted to have it finished sooner or something. Like there was just like this impulse to start. I think also something I know about myself is that if an idea lingers around for too long without like executing it or like really feeling like I'm making it, I can get a little bit I can get a little lost on the idea or like
Mm,
second guess the idea. And that happened for sure with Hedge, like over and over and over again, I think because we had that 2 years to do it. But at the same time, I was really grateful for that 2 years. And in that second year, I took a ton of classes, like all across the board, like screenwriting and more stop motion and a documentary class and just like all kinds of different approaches. So I think it was a really valuable
mm.
experience.
Hedge
Yeah.
doesn't feel like a student film to me at all.
Interesting.
I
Huh.
think that was the first piece of yours that I saw just on Vimeo.
Mm.
I didn't know anything about you, but I saw the film and I was like, wow, that's really exciting. I love all of these clusters of figures. I love the palette. I love the
Mm.
tone. Um, I showed Hedge to my students in the fall and they loved it too. I think they were very excited by the minimalism of some shots and then the fullness of other shots and the space that makes.
Mm.
Um, it feels very much like Hedge was a seminal piece for you, I guess. Do you still feel that way? Because I feel
I've
connections from Hedge and all your other work, your future
You
work.
know, I struggled so much with that film, and I've never thought of it as a seminal film.
Oh, really?
I've thought of it as like one of my biggest struggles,
Mm,
and it took me about a year to even look at it again after I finished it because I was so like, making things is so vulnerable. I think
true.
I really struggled with that one the whole time, and I think it was partially because I was in school. I I work pretty quickly, so I would come in with like a whole scene and I would feel kind of good about it, and but often like the way that I was working was super like by the gut. Like I would just sort of be like, I think now I want to animate a scene of just like a bunch of women crying. And
Hmm.
that makes sense to me, but when you bring that into an educational context, I think even in an experimental animation program, it felt a little bit like people were like, but why?
Mm,
Like you're moving away from your initial idea, like, you know, where is this going? And I think at a certain point I was like, I don't know where this is going. I know that I moved away from my initial idea, and I was just like basically trying to work through it and like stay like healthy. Cause I think, especially a thesis project, like it sounds like you teach as well. Those can be really just like massively anxiety inducing. I think
hmm.
especially when you're in a grad program, the pressure on it to be sort of like this magnum opus or like
Right.
whatever.
To be very complete.
Yeah, and I think by the time I finished that film, like I finished it by just deciding it was done. Like I was like, this is done now. Like there was no like, it wasn't like I was following a storyboard that was strict, and I knew that I was just animating scenes, and that when I was done doing that and done doing the sound and done doing the mix, that I was finished. I just sort of made a decision one day that I was finished. Not working on this anymore. I've given it enough time and attention. And that was such a good decision.
Mm,
Like, because I think I could have kept just sort of grinding away at it and chewing on it to the point of never finishing it.
hmm.
So yeah, finishing that was tough. And I remember feeling like I'm never going to submit this to anything. I don't want anyone to see this ever,
Mm,
ever, ever. I'm never going to put it online. And then I was encouraged to just submit it to Ottawa by my mentor. So I did. And then I tried to put that out of my mind because I was like, it's definitely going to get rejected. Like there's no way. And
mm.
not only did it get in, it also like won.
Which is a huge deal.
It was crazy. And of course, so that like really helped me understand that like, for all artists, I think, but especially for students, like at a certain point, all of that like negative self-talk or like questioning of your idea or the approach, like you just have to start ignoring it, like because it's actually not true. It's just like a way for you to torture yourself in the creative process. So
How do you feel about the film now?
I love it now. I think it's very weird. You know, that I finished that in 2018. It's 2023 now. There's been like a whole massive pandemic and like so much life has changed. Now I'm like, so great that you made that film. It's very strange. And I definitely refer to it when I'm feeling lost.
Mm.
Um, yeah, just sort of elements of like the way that I was working with architecture of space, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And like maybe this overall feeling of being lost in that film. Like there's sort of like the implication of like a chase in that film.
Mm-hmm.
It's like clustering, and then just like you're saying, like a real emphasis on like negative space or like what's happening in the quiet. And I think I can see how a lot of those motifs have carried through and continue to show up in my work, which and that stuff,
Definitely.
yeah.
You have a labyrinthine quality that you dip into sometimes, where these boxes or rooms or coffins, in the case of Hedge, kind of move and shift around each other, and the walls expand and contract, and
Yeah.
they feel very much like moving, hitting a
Yeah.
wall and moving left or right, and then hitting another wall, moving left or right. But it's happening at such speed that it doesn't become boxed in any way. And you're doing
Yeah.
a lot of that in that film.
Yeah.
The other thing that I really love about that film that seems like such a through line are, you sort of alluded to the cluster of crying women. I read in another interview that you saw them as representative of your aunts
Yeah.
at, it was your father's funeral that is being
Yeah.
referenced here, right, in the film. That cluster of women is so, it's so beautiful and complex, but it's also funny
Yeah.
too, and kind of
Yeah.
absurd,
Like
and
weirdly funny. Yeah.
the way they need to kiss everything around them, smother
Yeah.
them with love. It's very beautiful. It's very
Smother
relatable.
and smother them with mourning too. Like
Mm-hmm.
sort of like that film is that scene actually it was inspired by just like a very specific memory, which I'll just tell you what the memory is because I do think it's kind of fun. I was 5 years old when my father died, and it was during the summer, and we had this like little plastic kiddie pool that we would put in the sidewalk and like fill it with the hose. And I was out there with my little brother, who was 1 at the time, and I ran inside the house because I don't really remember what the reason was, but the way that the house was laid out was like there was the door and a tiny little staircase and then the kitchen. And my mother was in the kitchen with all of my aunts. She's one of seven siblings. So it's, a huge extended family. And I run in and I just paused and I said out loud to all of them, oh, like daddy just tapped me on the shoulder, who's like, my father is dead. And it was just, and then I like ran to the bathroom or something. And all of them in sync, like just this wild synchronous like sob, like, and it was like my fault, like that's how I
Oh
felt in the
no.
moment. I was like so affected by this, like this sort of off the cuff, who knows, maybe I was joking around, maybe I was like feeling something, I don't know what the impulse was there, the impulse of a 5-year-old, but that response, it was like I said the thing, there was this utter silence, and then like all at once like
Mm.
and I almost wonder if any of them remember that moment or if it's in my mind just like glued to like
Right.
that
Well,
feeling.
you were 5 and you had some kind of emotional power that
Yeah.
affected adults. That's a
Yeah.
big deal, right?
Because and they were in such a state, like this was what it was for weeks. Just and I understood to a certain extent, but I think that scared me a little bit. Like, even though
Mm.
but it was also almost, I think, as for a 5-year-old, like sometimes you don't know whether to laugh or cry.
Sure.
Like, whoa, like, what is this? I don't know.
Feel that way as an adult.
Me too. I mean, but I think it's a little, it's almost harder to, no, maybe it's just the same. I was gonna say maybe it's harder to differentiate when you're 5, but maybe not.
Oh boy. Well, you capture that cluster of figures and that memory really beautifully. And I guess I see you using that kind of shifting grouping technique is not really the right word, but like approach with a lot of other figures and animals in your future work. Maybe maybe like the birds of paradise or something would be a good example in the future work. Can you tell us a little bit technically about how you get into something like that? Because it clearly must be a very different approach from having a singular figure making an action or a walk versus wrestling 8,
Crowd.
3, 5 other different figures, and any major kind of losing track of which direction one is going is going to really jump out at the eye. But you clearly allow for some of that that kind of letting it take you where it will. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear as like something that you notice. And yes, like I definitely do tend to cluster. I like to make crowds. It's almost like claustrophobic. I can tell you that in Hedge, with that cluster of women, they appeared over and over again. Often I was animating all of them on the same sheet of paper.
It feels that way.
I didn't know how I was going to handle that. And for whatever reason, I felt like I just wanted to do it that way. I also wanted them to feel almost like physically connected to one another. So I was like, I'm just going to try to do this and see how it goes. What I ended up doing for that film, which I haven't done again, like I've changed my approach, but I started by basically painting in, so their hair that like is just like black ink, and then everything else is pencil. I made animation just of like the roughs of their heads, like just a bunch of circles like floating around. That was like my first pass, and then I would shoot that into the camera and be like, okay, I like how that they're sort of like floating in a way, like that there's this sort of like confusion about gravity, which I like, but I like how they're kind of interacting. Like there's almost like some of them feel like magnets, or like, you know, they're getting like repelled,
sort of like stalks on a base or something.
Yeah. So that's how I started. And then I would go in and I would do their bodies, which were basically just like random shapes with like boobs. And then I would add like arms. Like very rarely do they have legs. They're just like little tiny feet. And I was just doing one at a time. And so I would like lay in one of them, and then I would lay in the closest figure next to that one. And then I would shoot that again under the camera and say like, is this going to work? And that it did work, but it was like, it was incredibly laborious. Like it was kind of silly that I was doing it this way, but I wanted to treat them like a shape. And then the last pass after I did all that was like inking in their hair, which I felt like cemented or almost like grounded them as like, I don't know, it somehow it made it feel like they were heavier or something.
It's a wash across all of them. It's also the most punchy tone, color.
So that's how I handled that. And then I knew that I wanted to deal with this feeling of like a crowd again. And I think, that music video for Toth, No Reason, is where I did this again with the birds. And with those birds, I wanted to think of them as like, again, like a force, like less about like thinking of them as like individual birds, and more like this like parade or like crowd or thing that's both like imposing and also like very beautiful. You're kind of like attracted to. So with that film, I was animating them each separately. Some of them are just duplicated. Like once I photographed them, I keyed at the paper and composited them in different ways. Some of them are, you know, I would draw like 3, I don't even remember what kind of bird. There's a bird where they're sort of like chasing the woman at the end, and then they pass her and go into the water. Those ones, I drew a couple of different ones just so that there was like some variation. But it was a much different process and much faster. Also, that was a music video, so I was trying to figure out like processes that would allow me to not spend too much time.
You have to fill up 4 minutes or 4.5 minutes or whatever. It's a big job.
It's a big job, though, you know, with that project, I felt I just felt so excited to work on it. Like there was this opportunity again for like spaciousness in it, in the piece. Like it's not always, there's not always a ton happening in every scene. Like sometimes we're just looking at the smallest thing, but it's just enough to carry you. And I really like that balance. And it was nice that I was able to do that in that piece. Yeah.
I'd love to get back onto your way into the music videos and some of those particulars. But first, I do have to ask you just a bit more about birds in general,
Okay.
because there are birds all over your work. There's a kind of pseudo chicken in Batfish Stew. There are the birds of paradise dancing in the Toth music video. There are lots of pelicans in the Rubblebucket music video. What is going on with these birds? Are you a massive nature person? And the second part of this question is, you are a New Yorker living here, but there's very little of an urban feel or references to urban life at all in your work. Everything is either a tight interior or like a broad open, plain desert space of some kind.
Yeah.
First part was birds. Then I got into just nature.
So I feel like when I got to California, I was heavily impacted by the environment. And I think that's why you see a lot of open spaces and desert landscapes and animals. The bird thing, it's like, I'm not even sure how to talk about this, but I really like the idea of having a creature that seems to know what's going on. And I think this started in Batfish, where I was like, everything is chaotic. It seems as if none of the human characters are really on top of what's going on. They're like too involved in their own psychic
too
space.
Anxious or something.
They're freaking out. Yeah, and every single one of them is kind of just like, ugh. But there's this bird that seems to kind of know what's up, almost this like all-knowing, like sort of powerful observer. And I, initially that was going to be a pig because we had a pet pig growing up. But I changed it to a bird for a couple reasons. I don't even remember what the reasons were. I think it was like something about the way that the narrative could interact with the bird made sense to me. Because it comes in there at the end and kind of causes the climax or like the destruction of the pattern that all the people are in. But I got to admit, like, I don't really know where that came from. I grew up with a ton of guinea hens around all the time. And actually, when I was like 20, I tried to make a sand animation. It's like the first animation, the real first animation, and it was about a bird. It was about a guinea hen named Shirley. But I think after Batfish, once I had used that bird character as like a device, like to me, it felt like really interesting to have this anchor. I think that's why it started recurring over and over again. And that also was like, there's no birds in hedge. That's interesting. I guess I took a break.
So interior.
Yeah, right.
I guess Batfish is very interior too.
Yeah, that was an indoor bird. The project that I used birds again in next was Annihilation Song for Rubblebucket. And I remember they sent me the song and there was like this part where they're just sort of like, to me, I was like, the vocals, they're just like cawing, like they're just like, they're making a bird sound, obviously, even though I don't know that someone else would have felt that way. And I just like had this idea that they should be pelicans, like that there should be two pelicans who are following these two humans on this very bizarre car journey. And they kind of know what's going on. And ultimately in the end, like the driver morphs into a pelican. And it's just like, again, it was this idea of like power. And I actually really don't know where that comes from. And then I was watching I was watching a bunch of videos of birds of paradise because I thought there was something really interesting about that mating ritual and also the trickery of a bird, like the way that they sort of interact and create a performance, and also how it feels like choreography. And I think just as someone who's like interested in like moving things, that really was drawing my attention. And then that's when I got this project for Toth, and I was like, okay, so we're gonna have birds of paradise. I mean, and I forget what they're called, not birds of paradise. I can't remember. It's been so
I'm not
long.
sure what their name is either, but you're talking about the birds that create the almost mask-like
Yeah.
visage with the wings.
Yeah, I can't remember what they're called, but it doesn't matter. So that whole idea of like a bird that transforms itself becomes something else entirely, like to the eye anyway, almost becomes like a smiling like jack-o'-lantern, like that's how it looks to me. And that being another source for trickery. So in that project, we have this like solo woman who's once again a character who's like kind of lost, moving through like a vast kind of open space, and who's being both tricked and guided by these birds. And ultimately they guide her to like a body of open water, and then it just ends there. So like we don't know what happens to her. We don't know where she goes. We don't know if she goes in the water and follows them. But I just think there's something interesting about using nature or animals as like a prompt and being able to like rely on them.
Yeah. Well, I love your birds.
Thanks.
They're very recognizable birds, but birds themselves have a kind of open-ended quality to them, like you're alluding to. And I grew. Oh, go ahead.
I just finished a music video for Cecile Salvant, and I don't know if there are any like explicit birds, but there's a horse that has bird legs and a beak. Again, like something about that. I was like, well, maybe it would be interesting to pair this idea of like a heavy horse that's sort of like we think of like culturally in a very specific way, but give it bird legs and a beak and almost make it into something that's like, I don't know, like about to take off.
Mythological in some way, like a griffin or something.
Yeah, or like going into that territory a bit. Yeah, it's definitely they reappear over and over.
Well, you'd mentioned the word choreography, which was a little buzzword I'd written down in my notes for talking with you as well, because you have a real flair for capturing the subtle rhythms of the music in the music videos through kind of looping movements, head bobs, walk cycles. In the King Gizzard video, the long legs kind of coming over each other, and all of the birds do this too. The bird of paradise with like the back and forths. It matches so well with the rhythm of the actual music. How is that process for you? Is that a natural process for you because you've envisioned how that's going to work out, or does that come through the process of drawing? Does that happen more in the edit? Can you tell us a little bit about that? And what's your relationship to dance and movement and choreography anyway? Is that something that you do? Is that something that informs other parts of your life? Or is that something that you do just on the page?
Yeah. First of all, I think that the relationship between choreography and music happens in every part of the process. So I'll start by just listening to the song and start drawing, like sort of whatever comes to mind, and ultimately develop. Usually not a very full idea, honestly. Usually I'll develop a couple of motifs, and those motifs end up being like the through line for the video. When I'm actually animating a sequence, I'm listening to the music, and I'm not planning it out in the timeline, because I guess I just I don't love that step. I kind of tend to skip that. So what I'll do is I'll animate a sequence. I'll kind of like try to intuitively like think about how it might suit a piece of the music, and then shoot that, do like a pencil test, and then rough it in to the timeline and see how it sits. And often it it works. But I also think we have a tendency to like sync sound and image.
We make it work.
We make it work. Yeah. So I think like in many ways, like that tendency is like to my advantage.
Mm.
But you know, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes I have to go back, or it turns out that that idea that I had actually goes somewhere else. Like maybe it goes somewhere else in the video, and that's when editing comes in. Or it doesn't work and it's goes into the bin, or it's saved for something, another project later. But I think about it a lot. And I think when listening to music, like, you know, there's a part of that might be a little bit tiring, where you're like, am I going to hate this song by the time I'm done with this video? But often what happens, like actually almost like every time, is I end up hearing the song in like a million different ways. And I hear things that I didn't initially hear. And then I'm able to like emphasize like things that actually might be smaller in the song, or things that were less noticeable to begin with. And I love that. I love that process. Like that brings me a lot of joy. It feels really good to almost like get to know something really deeply. And especially like I'm not a musician. I like tinker around. So I don't know. I've never made a song. Like I don't know what it's like necessarily. I have a lot of friends who are musicians, but it is really nice to just get really intimate with something in that way. In terms of dance, I wanted to be a dancer very badly when I was a kid, but I was like also horribly shy. So I never did it. And I almost wonder if animation is like a part, it's sort of like how I am getting to dance in a different way, or like how I made my way into movement in another way, in like sort of just like a visual, you know, still physical, but in less literal way. It still feels like the practice of making animation is like very embodied. And I use my body all the time to like try and figure things out and think about how I want something to move. I also like, I just love thinking about dance when I was teaching. So last year I was in LA all year teaching at CalArts.
Oh, okay.
Amazing. I've kind of been like a little bit of a boomerang, but I ended up doing basically a year-long collaboration with the dance school, which just happened completely naturally. Like on the first day of class, I met one of the dance professors, Tushen, and I was like, we should do something. I was teaching a drawing class, and I was like, I really think it would be valuable for the dancers and the animators to like have to interact in certain ways. So we did a couple of workshops where I brought in a bunch of drawing prompts, and Tushen brought in some like really basic like movement ideas, and we had everyone do everything. So all the dancers were drawing, all the animators were dancing and moving, and it was incredible. And then they all made work based on this workshop. And then we came back together and turned that into like an installation. And then we had the dancers do improvised movements based on the installation. And it was just like, it just kept going. And it was so much fun. And so I think I am just very drawn to choreographed movement, but I am not a dancer, and I've never been a dancer.
That project sounds lovely.
It was wonderful.
That sounds great. I can definitely identify with, I've always wanted to be a performer of some kind.
Yeah.
That's how I, you know, when I have my dreams at night, I'm like, I see myself on the stage with a spotlight. But when it comes down to actually doing that, I just clam right up. So I think of my own work sometimes as a translation of performance.
And another path to performance. Like I think it's great.
Indeed. Will you talk with us a little bit about working on My Year of Dicks?
Sure, I would love to. Oh my gosh.
So it's so funny. It's so good. Your work slots in there so perfectly. Like I recognize when it was your segment right away, but it's a great fit. It's a great match. So I guess my first question is a little bit about logistics. There is an initial writer, Pamela. There's a director, Sarah. There are, I'm sure, a bunch of sound designers and other contributing animators and musicians, producers. It's quite it's quite a long film as well. So what was the process like getting involved? How much communication was there between you and the other moving parts? How much back and forth was there? Anything you can tell us about that experience
Yeah.
with the
Well,
illuminating?
first, I think the first thing to say is like that crew was actually very tiny.
I guess for an Oscar nominated short is very tiny. You're right.
Yeah, yeah, and I think you know, I'm someone who usually basically works alone, right? Like I have the collaborator and then I'm working alone unless I choose to hire like one assistant to help me with the animation. But so in that sense, I was like, whoa, there's a whole crew here. But looking back on it now, I'm like that there were basically 6 or 7 animators, one sound designer, one person doing the music. Jeanette Bonds was the producer. She's also the person who runs the Glass Animation Festival.
Oh, right.
Sarah Gunner's daughter, I had worked with before on projects, and she's wonderful. And she was also my very, basically my neighbor in Brooklyn for a while. So we had a really good working relationship already, which is why she brought me onto the project. And then Pam, the writer, who was just like hilarious, like so fun and so funny to work with. So basically the way that it worked was Pam had written this book called Notes to Boys and wanted to turn it into a TV series. And Pam linked with Jeanette, and they were sort of linked in with FX, and it was going to air on a show called Cake. So when I was initially hired for the job, it was like, we're making a TV show. It's going to be on Cake, like, do you want to work on it? And that was cool. Like that was exciting. And basically what they did before they brought in the animators was I forgot to mention the voice actors. They got a lot of the voice acting done ahead of time so that Sarah could go ahead and make an animatic. And the animatic was beautiful. And it was actually the first time probably that I had worked with an animatic that was like timed exactly how it was needed to be. And yeah, like there really wasn't room. Like you're like, yep, this is the shot. I know I'm animating 3 seconds. I'm doing a lip sync. It's, it's all clear. So once they were done with the animatic and that was feeling concrete, that's when they brought in us animators. And this was during pandemic. So everything was on Zoom. We had like an initial meeting where they had created a production schedule where the shots had been divided amongst us. So we all animated every episode or every chapter. But we were all each given like a special chapter.
I see. So you were working on I'm assuming a lot of that footage is rotoscoped. You were working on a lot of that.
Yeah. So the first chapter we did was the chapter where mine was the special animation. So it was the horror show. And when we started, we didn't have that. We didn't have a workflow. We were just, we were given the shots and it was kind of like, well, maybe you make reference, but we just know that we want the real life to feel sort of naturalistic. And we want Pam's psychological state to be the special animation, like where it's treated in a different way.
A little more imaginative.
Yeah.
Open-ended.
So in that episode, the horror show, I keep calling it an episode because that's what it was initially, that chapter.
Excuse me.
That was when we kind of figured out how to make the film because we didn't have that. So we all started like making our own reference and that was fine, but it was becoming like really time consuming. So at a certain point toward the end of that episode, Sarah and Pam and also some of the voice actors started actually just creating reference video for us for every chapter. So we'd work one chapter at a time. Eventually we were given our shots and we were also given reference video for like the real sequences. And then, yeah, we would just animate all the time, just the line work. And then that would get passed off to a colorist. And then finished shots would get passed to the compositor. And the compositor is Ethan, Sarah's husband. Like it just felt like very, very cozy.
Felt tight knit.
Yeah.
Well, it's nice that even in your sequence, your special sequence, the horror show, there's a specific shot or couple of shots where the more naturalistic feeling animation for like the present day is happening, but your horror show alternate styling is happening on the TV screen
Yeah.
right behind. So the two things are actually living in different worlds in the same
Yeah.
shot, which is really nice.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was really fun. It was just so fun to work on it. I think, you know, when we each got, when we started our individual chapters, we would have a meeting with Sarah and Pam. And I just remember in that initial Zoom meeting, Pam had she's like a horror movie freak, and it was so fun because she just was dropping all these film recommendations, and I just watched horror for like 2 weeks straight.
That's got
Well,
to be great for the mind.
I mean, I also like horror, but I'm definitely not like I don't think I'd ever watched so many horror movies like all in a row. So that was just like really fun, and also it was like I didn't know who Pam was. So this was like sort of my introduction to her, and
Right.
how hilarious she is, and how she was just like so excited and so game for us to just like do our thing. And there was very little like back and forth. Like I don't think I got a single note on that project.
That's great. I'm happy to hear that. And the film comes across that way. It feels quite open. It feels like it was a relatively smooth, streamlined process in a way. It's very there's nothing stodgy about it. And
Yeah.
it reflects the writing, which is so light in some
Yeah.
ways, and so effervescent.
Yeah.
Well, what was it like going to the actual Oscars? Was that
It was kind of fun.
weird? Was it amazing? Was it?
Both. It was, I don't, have you spent much time in Hollywood?
I have been to Hollywood one time.
Okay. So the Oscars take place in the Dolby Theater on like Hollywood Boulevard.
Okay.
So like the street with all the stars, right?
Right.
And so I'll just like try and paint the scene. I got there, and there's like just a huge like gate around everything with people just like pressed up against the gate, like just trying to see celebrities, and
Cameras going off everywhere.
everything. It was just, it was like a rat race. And I was trying to get into the building, and I kept being pointed by security in like the wrong direction. So I walked around for like maybe like 30 minutes trying to get in. And also Josh Schaffner, one of the other animators, was kind of doing the same thing, but we were like on other sides of the building. And at a certain point, I was like about to be late, basically. I was like, I like gotta get in. Like this is getting really stressful.
Wow.
And I'm going down this pathway just packed with people trying to see celebrities, and the actual street is packed with like black SUVs full of celebrities. And I end up telling a security guard on the inside of the gate that I just like really need to get in there. Like I was like flashing my ticket, and then this crowd of like 15 other people who were trying to get to the Oscars like surrounded me, and they're like, us too, like what is going
Like
on?
she's a leader. She knows how to get in there.
They ended up opening the gate, escorting us across all the black SUVs while like the people are like trying to, it was just like crazy. I was like, this is so almost exactly what I expected, but also like very weird. And then you go inside, and there's like red velvet draped on everything, and you're immediately like, there are the celebrities and there is everyone else. You get like funneled. Um uh and I think the most interesting thing about like that space was that it's essentially like a mall slash like office building, just like sort of draped in
Some
fabric.
red.
Yeah, but you can really feel it. You're like, yeah, this is a mall. Like this is crazy. And then, but when you actually go into the theater, that's when you're like, right, this is for television. Like this is what we see. Like this is what this event really is about. Like presenting the awards like on TV. So it was just interesting to have that like weird kind of behind the scenes, but it was so fun. Like it was so fun. It was open bar the whole time. We were drinking martinis. Like it was lovely. Under every seat, they had like a little box of, it was like
goodie bag.
it was like a goodie bag, but it was like a pretzel and raisinets and water.
Wow. That's amazing.
It was
Raisinets, not bad. Okay.
not bad, but a surprising choice. I was like, this must be referencing some old Hollywood
Sure.
thing. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe Robert Redford just loved raisinets or something.
Maybe.
Who knows?
I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's a pretty amazing experience. And congratulations too.
Thanks. It was so fun. I forgot about the winning and losing part. I was just like, we're at the Oscars.
That's
And
a
then,
good place to be. It's a very good
well,
place.
that's how I felt until we lost. And then I was like,
And then
oh,
you're like, okay, that hurts.
bummer. Yeah.
Well, I'm hopeful that you will be back soon.
Thanks. I mean, that would be fun. We'll see.
So, kind of my last question for you, sort of an open-ended question, is this project, My Year of Ticks, one of your more recent projects, I'm assuming. As we were saying, not a massive team, but quite a production in terms of a lot of moving pieces needing to come together. When I was looking at your Vimeo page and just kind of going all the way back, I found some really nice little experimental pieces. One featuring you kind of casually chatting with your mom about her cars that she had, and then you kind of visually reacting and making some drawings and boils and things like that with it. And to me, these two things, there's a lot of space in between them. They're obviously very connected to each other. What's coming up next for you? Is there something more in the vein of something like Hedge that feels quite particular to you and your history? Do you see yourself continuing to work on larger and larger collaborations, more in the quote unquote film world? Where do you see yourself moving? Are you going to try and just do a little bit of everything?
Oh, I'm gonna do both. Yeah. So, my overall sort of framework is a little bit different now. So for a few years, I was working as a full-time freelancer, basically, until I started teaching adjunct. But now I'm teaching full-time at Parsons. So I have a full-time job, which is like a very different experience. So what that does for me, though, is that it takes the pressure off of needing to make money all the time with my creative work. And my hope is that I can really prioritize projects that are like super exciting for me. So at this point, my most immediate or my soonest plan is basically this summer, I'm going to make a film. I almost don't even want to talk about it because I feel like the more that I talk about it feels it's like I just want to make it. And it will be much more in the vein of Hedge, like for sure. And also, yeah, there are like several bigger projects that may or may not come to fruition. We'll see, or maybe will happen starting more like in the fall. But I'm very excited starting basically now to focus in again on just making a really very physical, like manual personal film. I'm really interested in like sticking with that, like getting into sort of like a zone of like memoir sort of, but also like experimental animation that sort of maybe reads more like poetry than like strict narrative, but also involves character. Like, so that's where my head is kind of there, and I'm really excited to just be able to have some time to play around. So that's what's like immediate.
That sounds lovely.
Yeah, I'm looking forward.
Your audience is excited too. I can speak for them because I am
them. That's awesome. Great. It's nice to have that sort of like, yes, I just want to make a film, and if it goes into a closet and it's never seen, like fine, but also it's nice to feel like people will watch it.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything that you would like to leave us with? Anything pressing on your mind? Anything you feel passionately about? Anything you've seen lately that inspired you? It could be anything.
Oh, yeah. Let me think about it for a second. I think this is not the best note to end on, but I'm just gonna say it because it's the thing that's come up.
Okay.
I'm thinking about AI a lot.
I had thought about asking you about AI, and then I was like, we're having a nice conversation. Don't want to get a sour look on my face,
I'm
but
gonna ruin it.
get in there. Go for it.
Well, so you know, as like a professor, it also feels like my responsibility to like talk about it. And you know, in my department, we just had like a panel on AI, and the student response was really interesting.
Mm.
Um, it was almost like, we don't even want to talk about this. We are against this, and you professors need to protect us from this in some way, right? Like, and it was just interesting to have that response, because you know, I feel like, you know, it has to be up for discussion. Doesn't mean we have to
Sure.
participate, but we do have to find a way to interact. And so I've been thinking about that in my own work. You know, of course, like it's going to impact animation, it's going to impact visual art. And I guess my takeaway from all of that is, and maybe this is also part of the impulse to just like make a really niche film, just get as physical as possible. Like I want my work to exist in real life as much as it exists digitally. And I'm like, yeah, it's making me almost want to like make sculpture, or like just really like get working with my hands, like really get it off of the screen and out of the internet, and just get as physical as possible. And maybe that's sort of opting out. I think it actually kind of is an opt out of AI in a big way. But yeah, something about that makes me excited, or like inspires me. Trying to find like an angle to look at this. It's like, yeah, this is great. It's going to inspire me to really like get my hands dirty.
Yeah, it can be a rallying cry in a
Yeah.
way. And I do think that we circle around our roots over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And my roots were as a painter.
Yeah.
That was my training. That was everything that I loved as a kid, painting, painting, painting. And even now with my filmmaking, I still see myself as a painter, even though I haven't actually stretched a canvas and taken a brush with pigment and moved it across that surface in a decade, maybe. I don't know. I still see myself as a painter. I just can't help it.
Yeah.
And something about painting still does feel like the ultimate antithesis to AI animation or AI illustration, whatever. So I completely understand that instinct. And I think it can be healthy to have something solid to just hold on to when things are changing so rapidly and seem very much out of our control.
Yeah. That's the note I'll leave it on.
Got it. Got it. Well, I hope that you and your colleagues can help your students feel safe. I'm not sure exactly what your students want you to do in the onslaught of ever-changing technology, but
Yeah. Yeah. I think transparency is always key. So like
good
if
point.
I, you know, like if any of us have like an idea about how to interact with this or how to opt out, I think we can just share it, you know.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, Amanda, thank you so much for talking with us. It was an inspiration. It was illuminating. It was really great. And your work is so beautiful. I'm excited to be able to, you already have a wonderful audience, but to be able to hopefully share it with even more people through Evergreen. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was really nice.
Absolutely.